Hi SSC101, this is your lecture video for chapter 4. So I'm going to go ahead and jump into the chapter 4 textbook link just to show you that chapter 4 is talking about listening, taking notes, and remembering. And so for this chapter, I'm going to rely primarily on the PowerPoint slides here in just a moment, but I always like to point out that whenever you are in the textbook, after the lecture, to go in and dig a little bit deeper, just make sure that you really are focusing in on the areas that you could most be benefiting from. So let's say that you really do nicely with active listening, but you need more help with your note taking. Just focus in on where you think you could get the most out of your time reading. So as I said, I'm going to focus mostly on this lecture with the slides. So I have the slides open up over here, and we'll go ahead and go through here. So listening, taking notes, and remembering. So basically the big takeaways is college is different from high school. And I know that almost sounds obvious, but we do have a lot of students who, whether they're right out of high school or they took a few years off, kind of just like transfer the high school mentality to college. Whereas there are a lot of key differences. For instance, the personal responsibility is huge. The learning is really on your shoulders, especially in light of those of you taking online courses. So whether this is your only online course or you take more online courses throughout your program, that responsibility for learning is on you, because we can provide materials to you, but it's up to you to ingest them, if you will, to take the time to read through them, to look at the PowerPoints, to click on different resources, to listen to the lectures. Part of that then is time management. You know, your time is managed on your own. It's no longer created for you throughout the day in a bell schedule. And you do have to really apply that learning cycle of going through different steps to make sure that you're taking in information to really get the most out of it. So this chapter will talk a little bit more about like being prepared, and so mentally prepared. And this is going to, you can think of it like on the whole scale holistically, but also just every single individual class. Mentally, how are you prepared for class? What is the goal you want to get out of every time you either listen to a lecture or step in a classroom? Are you looking to be able to find the main idea out of the lecture? Are you able to get some vocabulary? Are you able to get some questions answered by the end of the lecture? How is it going to connect to your overall progress in the course? And then, of course, there's physical preparation, which these things you've heard from your whole life, I'm sure. You know, sleep well, eat well, be prepared. I still have students on the first day of class who do not come with anything in my face-to-face classes. So even though it sounds common sense, I still have students who don't have something to write with on day one. So having like little things like that ready. Be on time. That could be the first day of class, but all semester, making sure that you're getting there. Because sometimes when we're running late, that creates a little bit of anxiety, and therefore our mental space is impacted whenever we are kind of feeling like we're rushed or behind. And then making sure that we don't have distractions. So your phone, your devices in general are typically a fairly large distraction. So we want to make sure that those are not there to create an additional barrier to any type of learning that we may have going on. But know what your distractions are. Maybe if it's not your device, maybe it's a certain place in the classroom where you can see what's going on out the window or people making noise. Just be aware of your distractions so that you can do the best you can to eliminate them or reduce them as much as possible. Whenever you are listening to lectures, and again, this could be face-to-face or online, and you'll have to adapt it based on that modality, but this goes right back to what we just talked about, being in the right mind space so that you are ready to hear the information. Sometimes it's really hard to separate life from academics. I understand that. But when you walk into a classroom where you sit in front of your device to listen to a lecture or to do your work in an online class, it really is so essential to try to kind of put life, if you will, to the side for just that block of time. And I think I mentioned this in a previous video. What I like to do before I sit down to do an academic task is I get a piece of paper or a Post-it note. In fact, I have one beside me right here. And I write down the things that I need to do personally. So if I have to go and do the laundry, or if I have to make a phone call or do a grocery list, I write it down right next to me so that I know that as soon as I'm done with my academic space, I look at my personal to-do list and I can work on that. So sometimes it just helps me focus more on what I'm supposed to be doing. You also want to make sure, again, you're in that physical space. Here on Stark State's campus, we have smaller classrooms, and so it's easy to kind of stay focused. But if you're in a classroom where it's fairly large and there's a lot of people, as uncomfortable as it may be, try to sit toward the front of the room. You're more likely to make eye contact, to stay awake, to kind of avoid distractions for that. Focus on what's being said. We talked a little bit just a couple minutes ago about eliminating distractions. If you're using your computer or the computer in front of you on campus, try not to be using it for any other purpose except for if you're using it for your textbook or note taking. Listen for new ideas, and then listen for signals when your instructor is speaking. So you obviously you can hear my voice right now, but when you're in the classroom as well, you listen for someone who repeats an idea, or they lower or raise their voice, or they almost get like excited and they talk a little bit more quickly. They write something on the board. Those are all cues that you should really be paying attention, I mean all the time, but really be paying attention to those particular ideas. You also want to look for what's not being said. That can be just as important, because if there is a section of the textbook that the author just kind of grazes over, you know that it's more than likely not as important, unless they specifically say, hey, you need to know everything. But if they're not covering it a lot in class, it's more than likely not going to be as important in the big scheme of what is being covered. Sort the information you want to look through, and this is going to build off of this. Look through what is emphasized in the textbook, what is emphasized in the lecture, and take notes. Part of chapter 4 is going to talk about different note-taking modalities, and so find what works best for you. Now, if you're not a note taker by nature, it's not the way that you learn, that's okay. Not everyone has to take a boatload of notes, although taking some notes is beneficial to everyone. There's a lot of connection between note-taking, memory, review, understanding, and how you take notes is going to differ based on if you're taking like like an application or typing versus paper, pencil note taking, and there's different ways to go about it. But note taking is an integral part in your learning. Something else that's really helpful is asking questions. And I know that sounds, once again, kind of common sense or simple, but a lot of students feel uncomfortable asking questions. And I totally understand that. When I'm in the student role, I sometimes hesitate to ask questions, but I always like to remind myself that, no, I'm paying to take this class, or I am paying to get this degree. And if I need to know this information, I need to ask the question. That's why we're here, is to learn from people who have more answers than we do in certain subjects. So that's really important. If you're not comfortable asking questions in class, send an email, stay after class, write it down, anything. I always appreciate the students who ask questions, even if it's something I already answered, because I want to make sure that they understand. If they need clarity, they can ask the question 5 times. Something that might be helpful to you is if you record lectures. And so obviously online class, you can replay it, but if you're sitting in a face-to-face class, ask the instructor if it's okay to record their lecture. Most instructors are okay with it, but it's always good to ask permission first. But that way, maybe if you feel like it's hard to take notes while listening, you can focus just on listening during the lecture and then go back and re-listen to take notes. That could help you be a little bit more active in your listening. So here are some tips, things to do if you have these occurrences. If your instructor speaks too quickly, sometimes you want to maybe just ask the instructor, like, hey, I'm just having a hard time keeping up in class. Can you go over something that we've missed? Really make sure that one of the best things you can do, honestly, is be prepared before class. And this is a reading strategy as well. So if you're doing chapter 4 in one of your classes, you don't want to wait until the day of. You want to read the chapter before the lecture, because you're cementing that prior knowledge. You're spending time with the information before you hear it. So reading ahead of time is a great preparation tool for comprehension, for note-taking, for listening, for overall just learning. Check in with other students. Sometimes other students might get something that you might not. And I know I mentioned this already, but I cannot emphasize enough how much utilize office hours. So instructors on Stark State campus are required to have 10 office hours. Sometimes it's face-to-face, sometimes it's through Zoom, sometimes it's in the learning center for their area, but utilize those. It's what those are there for. If there's an accent, I know sometimes that might happen. You may not understand what they're saying. Ask questions, see if someone else can fill in gap, kind of similar to this one above, and then go during office hours. And then if there's some trouble with understanding because of maybe they're too quiet, again, one of the best things you can do for listening is sit close and make good eye contact. That helps a lot. But it comes back to ask questions. Ask questions, seek assistance. Note taking. So I mentioned this a couple slides ago. It is really important because it does support your listening. I like to think that I have a good memory, and most of the time I do. However, if I'm somewhere and I'm like, oh, I'll remember that for later, and I don't write it down, it's gone. I won't remember that. Maybe not for hours, maybe not for days, maybe not ever. And so your note taking really does support your listening and your memory. It allows you to also test your understanding because you have kind of a study guide you create as you write notes, and you're creating those key ideas as well as kind of understanding what the instructor thinks is important. So note taking plays a really important role. And again, it's going to look different for everyone based on the type of note taking, the classroom that you're in, and what kind of learner you are as well. This section here does talk about different types of note taking. So I'm going to visit the textbook just to kind of see it a little bit more up close. I'm going to go here and click on Got Notes. And so I'm going to scroll down, and you can see a little bit larger than what's on the slide here. This goes through some different note-taking methods. And a lot of these you might already be familiar with. So listing, kind of like a bullet point, phrases, sometimes paragraphs, outline. Some people associate outlines more with writing or presentations. However, it's a really strong note-taking method as well. Concept maps are for those visual learners, and then Cornell note-taking method. So I'm going to scroll down just a little bit because the section really does go into detail, but this is where I'll say, like, if this is your area that you struggle with, really dig in here. So the list method is comfortable, but it's not always the most effective note-taking strategy. So that's why you want to make sure that you might play around with a couple note-taking. Sometimes students will say, well, oh, I took, let's say whatever class in high school, and I always took it through listing, and it's worked for me. Well, that's great, but it may not work for you in every class you take in college. And so that's why I like to tell students, like, test it around, test different methods to see what works well for you. But note-taking using the list method can be helpful if you have like a little bit of information. Outlining becomes a little bit more effective. It's really structured, so it creates this hierarchy. It doesn't have to be as formal as the Roman numerals, but this is a good setup for it. So it really does allow you to see how ideas relate to one another. It allows you to see the importance of ideas, and it organizes the text for you in general. Concept maps, this is again for those visual learners, and this is an example of a concept map, but I've had students use concept maps and they've created creative things out of it. They use flower petals or rainbows or their handprints, because really the idea is to make things put into a visual format, because some students are visual learners, and so they want to incorporate that into their note taking, and so they put this into the concept map method or mapping in general. So it's really great to capture ideas, to see how things are connected, and to see it in that visual format. And then Cornell method, this is where you take a piece of paper, you split it, like on the left-hand side, you write down a question, a term, a concept. On the right-hand side, you define that term, you go into detail in the concept, you explain it a little bit more. And then on the bottom, you leave a little space for a summary so that you put the ideas into your own words. And so this goes into more detail here. And this was developed at Cornell University, and it was really to help students with structuring their notes in a way that sets up a nice study guide. So that way you're kind of going back and you're kind of testing yourself, like, what's the left column say? And then the right column gives you the answers. So it is a nice, effective note-taking method. Some people are kind of polarized with it. Some people really like it. Some people don't. The point is, you want to find what works for you. And in our next week, note-taking will still be a topic. So we'll still talk about these types of note-taking. So I want to encourage you to think about, what method of note-taking do you already use? Do you think it's effective? And then maybe, is there one of these that you could be adapting for your needs for a certain class? Some other note-taking tips: be prepared. Again, have materials with you. Write only on one side of the paper. Sometimes that might help you with organizing your notes. One thing that I learned early on, it sounds, again, really simple, but label your notes. What day, what time, what class period, what chapter. Just make sure it's very clear what it is you're taking notes on. If you are typing your notes, make sure you can also see the instructor. Please don't try to write everything down. Some students still do this. They think they have to write every word down, and actually that's almost as non-effective as just not taking notes at all. You want to capture main ideas, things that are going to be important, things the instructor repeats or writes on the board. So leave some space so in case you need to go back and fill things in. Come up with a shorthand if it helps you to kind of use symbols and abbreviations. I like to also annotate and put things like in the margins, like my own questions, something that is not necessarily from the textbook or the instructor, but maybe I want to come back to later. Review your notes as soon as possible. So after that day is over, maybe like an hour later or that evening, go back and look to see if there's anything you missed or you just need to refresh your memory. That's going to help you build as you go throughout that chapter or that concept, whatever it is you're talking about. And then put things into your own words. I always like to tell students, don't take notes word for word out of the textbook. First of all, if you have to end up writing a paper on it or something and you use your notes, you might accidentally plagiarize if you forget that you wrote word for word. But not only that, learning has the most meaning when we can put things into our own words and when we can make meaning from it. So put things into your own words. And then finally, if you miss class, you want to make sure, hey, can I attend another class? Sometimes an instructor teaches the same class like on Monday, Wednesday, and then they teach it Tuesday, Thursday. Maybe you can pop into another class. See if they have notes online, see if a classmate can fill you in, and always check the syllabus. Missing a class is really not an excuse to not know what's going on because you have the class syllabus. You know exactly what was covered. And then a last little bit of the chapter talks about saving information to your long-term memory. We actually have the ability to remember things for an extremely long period of time. The part that's difficult is retrieving that information out of our long-term memory. So you really want to try to make sure you're linking things. If we can make information meaningful, we're more likely to remember it. Group things together, find ways to store the information that makes sense so you can retrieve it. I always like to think of it as a filing cabinet, right? If I file things in alphabetical order, it's going to be easier for me to find than if I just throw them in my filing cabinet. So if I remember things in a certain way, like using acronyms or rhymes or songs, it's going to be easier for me to retrieve those later. Picture superiority effect is what this is saying here. Visual imagery. We remember words and pictures together. Use the information. Don't just store it. Use it so that you are constantly bringing it back up so that it is playing a role in your daily academic life. Don't try to don't try to remember everything in these big holistic pieces. Break it down. Eliminate distractions. Repeat. There's a reason that when you were in elementary school, you had to write your spelling words 5 times each because repetition does help with memory. Practice testing is a great way to retrieve information. So whether it's flashcards, studying with a partner, making yourself a practice test, and then location. Again, this relates both to where you're studying and how you're getting information in because you are not having distractions around you, you're in academic space, but also just making sure that you are storing things in that logical way. All right, so again, I encourage you to go back into chapter 4, and really spend time in the area that you think you could most benefit from. I also want to just point out a couple other things in here. We have on my empowerment toolbox, which is going to talk about handshake. So that is a video that will upload, and it's really quick, about 3.5 minutes. So I encourage you to take a look at that for some resources. And then as it ties into chapter 4, becoming a better listener video, you can go ahead, it's going to take you to an outside resource, study.com, and you can go ahead and listen to this video. Again, not terribly long. All right. See you next time.